Welcome to Hopkins at Home. My name is Travis Reeder, and today's talk is called America's Opioid Dilemma. But this is not high scholarship for the most part. I'm going to do some storytelling, and some of that's going to be my own story. Some of that's going to be the story of North America and pain and opioid use. But I also take part of my job to set up this series that we're doing with Dr. Hannah Pickard, who's also on the line. And so she's going to be giving Friday's lecture. So one way to think about what I'm doing today is I wrote this book on pain and opioids and America's drug overdose crisis. And today is kind of a précis of the first 2/3 of that book. So it's really focusing on pain and how we treat pain in North America, especially. And there's going to be a lot of questions that leaves about the role that our pain medicine has played in America's drug overdose crisis. And although Hannah is not going to be talking specifically about the America's crisis, she's going to pick up on a bigger talk about addiction and the nature of addiction. That's going to, she and I can weave that together next Wednesday on our fireside chat, which I don't believe will actually involve any fires, but will be a chat nonetheless. So I'm going to start with a story, and funny enough, only looking at the date on my slide do I realize that the story starts almost exactly 5 years ago today. So May 23rd, 2015, I was about to go out for a Memorial Day motorcycle ride. This was the Saturday of Memorial Day weekend, and I was meeting a buddy, and I did not make it very far. I was about 3 blocks from my house, fully geared up, leather, body armors, the whole 9 yards. And nothing dramatic happened. There was a young man in a white van at neighborhood speeds who blew a stop sign, and he T-boned me on my motorcycle, hit me square on the left side, and it crushed my left foot between the bumper of the bumper of the van and the fairing of the motorcycle. And so the result of that impact was this. And so I know we met David and folks who are on the line early. We have at least one physician on the line. But for those of you non-physicians, that is not what a foot is supposed to look like. I know that you'll find that shocking. So what you're seeing here is several different things. When the first toe does this, it kind of crumples up underneath the other feet. It's actually called a traumatic bunion, which is a way too kind of cutesy a name for what it really is, but it's the kind of maximal extension that can happen, but it happens all in an instant. So it's a bunion, but it's traumatic. And then because of the force, you have all these little bone shards blow apart. And so the first metatarsal, this big bone here on the great toe, shattered, and all of those bone shards basically turned into shrapnel. And the shrapnel blew a hole out through the inside of my foot. So there were other breaks. The second and third metatarsal broke clean through. They actually came out through the top. But it was really this damage to the first metatarsal that was the dramatic stuff. And the reason I'm giving you this, apologies for if it's a bit gory detail level, is because that sets up what had to happen next. So when you have an injury like this, kind of unbeknownst to me at the time, this isn't just a broken foot. It's not just an injury. It's a medical trauma. I was in a limb salvage situation, which means the immediate threat was that they would have to amputate my foot. So that's the situation I went into on May 23rd. First thing in the morning, 9 a.m. or something, I would have my first emergency trauma surgery that evening in the hospital. And that would be the first of 6 total surgeries so far. Okay, so that's the setup. I can tell you the good news first to kind of like relax the air a little bit, which is that I got to keep my foot. So that's very nice. I still have a fully functional foot. If I was on the stage, as I very often am giving this talk, I could show you that I have a rather functional foot. I said fully functional, that's not true. A rather functional foot. So that's the good news. The bad news is when you're in a limb salvage situation, you kind of have 2 paths. One is amputation, one is reconstruction. You think amputation is the bad outcome, and even our framing of limb salvage makes it seem like amputation would be the horrible last result outcome, and we should do everything we can to save the foot. And that's actually how it was presented to me. These very smart, world-class DC area physicians were saying to me, we will try our best to save your foot. The thing is, reconstruction takes a really long time, a lot of surgeries, a lot of re-traumatizing. And so I would be in and out of hospitals for about 5 weeks in that initial stay. And what I'm going to focus on for, I don't know, the first half of today's talk is I want to focus on one particular day. It's June 16th. So the accident was May 23rd. I'm focused on June 16th. And the reason I'm going to do that is because on June 16th, I had surgery number 5. It was actually the day after I had surgery number 5. So it's the day I kind of fully came out of anesthesia from a really big surgery. And I think eventually, this is very much post hoc, I imposed a narrative on my own experience over the course of years. But I now think like one of the most important things I learned in this entire experience was encapsulated in my experience on June 16th. So that's what I'm going to talk about. Okay, so June 15th, the day before, I went into surgery number 5. And what had happened at that point is over the first 3 weeks, whatever it was, the various teams of surgeons had pulled all of these bone shards together, and my foot had revascularized. The blood flow had kind of returned before too much of the tissue died. And so the word was, you might get to keep your foot, maybe even all of the toes, right? That was the good news. The problem is there's still this big hole in the bottom of my foot. And I don't know if you realize this, but having a large hole in your body is kind of a problem. You can't just stitch closed a cut like you can a cut, right? I had never thought about this. It had never occurred to me. But if you lose a big chunk of flesh, it's like a logical problem, right? Like, how do you fix that? And it turns out the answer is we've devised lots of different surgeries to try and do that. Many of them failed over the last half century or so. But we're getting pretty good at something called a free flap. So that's what I got on June 15th. A free flap is you take a variety of tissues. It can be any combination. So my free flap was, I had a series of surgical teams rotate in throughout the day on June 15th. And they made an incision from my hip to my knee on my left leg. And then they carved out muscle to protect the exposed bone in my foot. So they carved out a piece of muscle and laid it in the foot. They carved out fat to lay over top of the muscle to provide cushion. Skin to go over top of all that. So that just sounds like a skin graft, right? But they took so much tissue to transplant that they actually needed to vascularize that tissue. It needed its own blood supply. So they had a microsurgery team come in and clip out an artery to put the artery in the foot to give it its own blood supply. And then a nerve team come in. They clipped out a nerve and transplanted that into the foot as well, thinking that I might want to feel something in this foot one day, which I have to say was a spectacularly bad idea. I would have been happy never feeling anything in that foot again. But that's another story for another talk. Okay. So that's what a free flap is. It took about 9 hours, 8.5 to 9 hours on June 15th. It's by far the longest of my surgeries. I was under anesthesia for a very long time. And I didn't really fully come out of it on the 15th. So the June 16th, that day I want to talk about, is the first day that I kind of fully come to my senses and a bunch of things happened at once. First, I realized that I was in excruciating pain. Second, I realized that one of the reasons I was in so much pain is because they not only had expanded this wound on my foot massively to do this surgery, I now had a second trauma site where they had caused the trauma, right? It was the surgeon's blades that had done the damage to me. And third, my pain medicine protocol hadn't been changed in light of this, right? I was already on IV hydromorphone, which is better known as brand name Dilaudid, and oral Oxycontin. And so they had just kind of kept that up. And so I wake up, I'm in excruciating pain, and I panic. So I immediately asked the ICU nurse. I was in the ICU, so I had my own dedicated nurse. I asked her to give me more pain medication. She said she'd try. Nothing happened. The intern came through, and I asked the intern to give me more pain medication, and he said he would try. Nothing happened. And this is just like a common experience at big university hospitals, big teaching hospitals, right? There are all these ladders. I eventually had one of the residents come through and check on me. I said, I'm okay, except I'm dying from pain and nobody's listening to me. He said, okay, I'll take it back to my attending. So the doctor in charge. So this is what happens all throughout that morning. I'm just trying not to scream. My partner, Sadia, who is usually my advocate, she's for most of the story, she's like my hero holding things together. She actually had to go to work this day because she'd been there the whole day with me during the surgery before. So I don't have anyone else to yell at anybody for me. And eventually I see the ICU attending, so the doc in charge, on rounds. And I know they're on rounds because she has her flock of white coats behind her, right? The residents and maybe the nurse and the pharmacist, whoever she needs on the team. And so I'm waiting for them to get to my room because I'm desperate to tell them that I need more pain medication and finally get things resolved. So I've been on rounds at Hopkins before for my own research. I know how this is supposed to work. They're supposed to come into my room, talk to me, and we formulate a plan, right? That's not what happened. They stood out in the hall and talked about me, and then finally came in. And I said, thank God you're here. I've been telling anyone who will listen, I'm under medicated. I'm behind the pain. I need more medication. And this very unhappy, judgmental attending brusquely looks up from her clipboard and says, yes, Dr. Reeder, your repeated requests for more pain medication have been noted. I'll discuss its appropriateness with my team. And they whoosh out. And I have no idea what had just happened. I knew enough to be ashamed because I had been scolded, and I know what being scolded feels like, right? So I knew enough to be ashamed, but I didn't get it. And so it would actually be months later before I kind of really fully understood what happened, because I would have to be out of the hospital, and I've gotten to a point where I was sharing some of my intimate details with friends and family, and I would tell this story, and they would be really offended on my behalf and say, well, we know what happened, right? You were treated with suspicion. And you were treated with suspicion because pain is suspicious. Pain reports are suspicious because pain is stigmatized. And the reason pain is stigmatized is because we very often treat pain with opioids, and opioids are stigmatized. And so there's this thing about pain where it's this essentially subjective phenomenon where you can never know for sure what my pain feels like. But it's my job as a patient to convey it to you, and it's your job as a clinician to understand it. Right? So there's this thing that we have to be able to get between us that we can't, in principle, can't get between us because there's no such thing as an objective painometer, right? And so it leads to this gulf of suspicion and stigma, and then we get really terrible language like drug seeker. So when I give versions of this talk to clinicians, I say, if you have that language in your vocabulary, scrub it now, let it never be said again. Because the purpose of the language of drug seeker is to delegitimize the patient's testimony. As soon as somebody is called a drug seeker, you never have to take them seriously again because they're just lying. They're malingering. They're exaggerating to get the good stuff, right? Now, on the one hand, the idea that I was a drug seeker is kind of crazy because I had 5 pins sticking out of my foot. I just had 5 surgeries in as many weeks, right? I was obviously in excruciating pain. But the crazy thing about pain and how deep the suspicion runs is you can still want the drugs a little too much. You can still claim that the pain is a little too bad, because even when you are in the hospital with a gunshot or a knife wound or a traumatic motorcycle injury, you might be asking for just a little more morphine than you really need. So the space for stigma is there. Okay, so that happens on June 16th, but I still have a really big problem because no one's given me medicine. And I'm still in excruciating pain. And so I have to kind of form a plan. And I do this thing that, again, I wouldn't reflect on for many months to understand how crazy this is and how important it is to reflect on. But what I basically did is I pulled together my privilege, right? Because I needed to get medication. And so I thought, who will give me morphine? Who will give me Dilaudid, fentanyl, what I need? And I thought about the one resident, so the younger doctor in training, the one resident who always spent a little extra time with me. He's a young guy, almost certainly younger than I was. He's the one who would always stick around and explain things to me when the attending would move on. And when I first got to the hospital before the surgery, he's the guy who called me Dr. Reeder instead of Mr. Reeder. The only clinician I ran into in my entire hospitalization who called me Dr. Reeder. So yeah, that's the guy I want, right? Because I know he'll take my testimony seriously because he's shown that he respects me. And so, we can come back to this during the Q&A if you want, or next week for those of you who want to stick around for the fireside chat. But I mean, a really important point here is the degree to which I pulled together my standing as, middle-class, professorial, Johns Hopkins white man and said, somebody who will listen to me, give me drugs, right? The sort of thing that a lot of folks in society can't do. So I did that. And it worked. So I had the nurse call that resident. He came. I told him the story. He was horrified on my behalf. And the reason he hadn't been in the room is he is the plastic surgeon's resident, not the ICU's resident. And so he said, well, my attending will hook you up. He called her. She called a pain management consult. Pain management team finally came through, and they gave me all the pills. All of them. As far as I can tell, they gave me all the drugs in the hospital. They increased my dose of IV hydromorphone. They increased my dose of oral oxycodone. They added a non-opioid drug that's thought to be good for neuropathic pain called gabapentin. They added IV acetaminophen, just IV Tylenol, which I'd never heard of and worked remarkably well, which is another interesting conversation. And I floated away into fairly comfortable oblivion, where I stayed for 10 days during the hospital stay. Okay, so if I stop the story there, what it sounds like is I was treated badly and I was treated well, right? I was treated with suspicion and had medication that I needed withheld, and then I was given the medication that I needed. The problem is that the story doesn't stop there, because that specialty pain team, whose existence is owed to the fact that we take pain really seriously and we medicate very seriously this very acute, severe traumatic pain. They never had any intention of seeing me again. So there was no plan. There was no long-term management theory for how I was going to be handled over the course of my hospitalization and after discharge. So I was given this incredibly aggressive regimen of opioid and non-opioid medication. And the only advice that I was given, which was written into my chart, right, is don't get behind the pain. So don't wait until you're in too much pain before you take the medication, because that's what happened. They told me, is you got behind the pain. And so dutifully take your medication. And you're going to experience tolerance, which means it's going to take more medication to get the same effect. And so when that happens, don't get behind the pain, call the prescribing doctor, and they'll give you a higher dose. And that is the entirety of the management education that I got. No word about, hey, risks of addiction, no word about overdose, no word about risk of just physical dependence. So forget addiction, but just the fact that when you take medication for long enough, taking it away hurts. So there was no plan. And I was eventually sent home after 10 days. I'd already been increasing my oral oxycodone dose by that time so I could wean off the IV medication to be discharged. I went home on pretty whopping doses of oxycodone and gabapentin, and I continued to increase that dose for the following month. So fast forward to 2 months after the initial accident, 2 months and change, I go back to see someone I hadn't seen in quite a while, the orthopedic trauma surgeon, the guy who initially saved my foot, who pulled those bone shards together and stabilized me. It's time for him to get new x-rays, to see the beautiful work that is my new free flap, to see if I might ever walk again. And he's doing the doctorly thing, asking me all these questions, right? We get to the, what's your pain level? What are you doing about it questions. We're like, oh, it's pretty manageable with the medication. How much am I taking, sweetie? And look at my partner, Sadia, and we do our calculation and we tell him the number. So just for any of the clinicians in the virtual room here who might be interested, the number is about 170 to 200 morphine milligram equivalents of oxycodone a day. And for those of you who don't know what that means, it's about twice the recommended maximum daily dose by the Centers for Disease Control, which is 90 MME. So he does what most doctors today would do, which is he kind of stops everything, slows way down, looks at me and says, Travis, that's way too much. It's been too long. You've got to get off the meds. So he's very serious and very concerned, but also very much not his problem. He's not been prescribing. He's not been seeing me. So he says, you've got to get off the meds. You can't just stop. At this point, you'll go into withdrawal if you just stop cold turkey. You need a tapering plan. Whoever's been prescribing you for you should write that plan. And so he sends me to the plastic surgeon who's been managing my prescription since I got back. So here's the point in the story where I'm going to skip to Cliff's notes and give you a reference. So what happens next is really terrible. And for a long time after I eventually shared this story, I got asked to give this talk over and over and over. And it's horrible and it's draining and it's traumatic and I don't like doing it. So now when I get asked to give this talk, I give a Cliff Notes version that helps me just kind of objectively detach. And I will tell you that when I decided I didn't want to do this anymore, I gave it one last time on the TED stage where they had nice high def cameras and good sound, and I would hopefully never have to give it again. So if you want to like get the full picture of my talk where I try to convince you just how bad opioid withdrawal is, you can find that at TED.com. But this is not a live button on the screen, by the way. I'm not gonna like press that and have you watch my TED talk because that would be really awkward. So instead, this is a reference for you if you want to hear more. But basically what happened is my plastic surgeon said, you're on this whopping dose of gabapentin, which is the non-opioid, and opioids. So we're just gonna cut everything into 4, divide everything by 4, and drop a quarter of your starting daily dose each week. And then in a month, you'll be off, right? And so just in case any of you are gonna like log off in a few minutes because you're tired of hearing me talk, let me just make sure you get the really important piece of information here, that if you were designing a tapering regimen to systematically torture somebody, you couldn't do much better than that, right? And the reason is, it's an aggressive enough cut that it will immediately launch you into acute withdrawal if you're at all sensitive to the withdrawal symptoms. But it's still slow enough that it will take 4 weeks. And so that's what happened to me. I went immediately into withdrawal within 12 hours of losing my first dose, and I stayed there for 29 days. So the Cliff Notes version of withdrawal. If all you know about withdrawal is the Hollywood version, you've seen it on TV or a movie, you have the idea that it's like this very uncomfortable flu-like thing where you shake and sweat on the couch, and then thank God there's a cut, and then it's the next scene, and the person white knuckled their way through withdrawal, and thank God that's over. So that's not what withdrawal is like, at least not for lots of people. Withdrawal tends to last for 7 to 10 days in its most acute phase every time you have a precipitous dose reduction. And so I didn't know any of this, of course, but that means that just about the point at which I might achieve a little bit of relief, I was going to drop the next dose and kind of re-enter hell. And it's not an uncomfortable experience. It's a torturous experience. The symptoms of withdrawal are basically for any drug that has dependence. So for any drug that makes it so that your brain becomes accustomed to it, and when you pull the carpet out from underneath your brain, it screams a little bit because it's expecting you to inject this back into its system, right? So any drug that has that property is called dependence. Withdrawal is basically the opposite of the drug's effects, right? So it's a good shorthand anyway. And so in addition to all these flu-like symptoms that you see, which are really pretty terrible, think about the worst case of flu you've ever had and multiply that by some order of magnitude. But opioids are analgesics, right? They're pain relievers. And so withdrawal, one of the predominant considerations here is that it's hyperalgesic. Withdrawal gives you an increased sensitivity to pain. So everything hurts, your muscles and your bones and your joints. And then, oh yeah, whatever you were medicating, that catches fire, right? But opioids are also sedatives. That's why they make you sleepy. That's why they can kill you, because they're respiratory sedatives. That's why they constipate you, because they're sedatives for your gut. Basically, they slow down your gut. So all that reverses. So that means diarrhea. That means you get a weird kind of hyperactivity. Your heart beats fast. You shake, those tremors, right? They keep you awake. You develop insomnia, right? But then opioids, of course, have one other really important feature, which is that they are euphoric. And so withdrawal is dysphoric. Withdrawal is kind of, in broad strokes, awful. It's awful physically, but it's awful psychologically as well. And so it can, if you ask 100 people who go through withdrawal what it's like, you'll get 100 different details, but some form of anxiety or depression. And for me, it was just crushing depression, right? So I already told you a bit about that timeline. Every week, you know, you might eventually have started to see the light at the end of the tunnel, but I didn't know that. And I dropped the next dose and re-entered the acute phase. Tapering also has this other like sick joke of nature built into it, which is that the further along you get in a taper, the worse it is, because the severity of the withdrawal depends on the percentage dose reduction. And so if you just make the numbers even for math, right? So if you're on 100 milligrams and you do that, divide it into 4, drop a quarter each week. Well, that first week, it's a quarter. It's 25 milligrams out of 100. But then your brain reestablishes homeostasis very slowly. So you're just about getting through that acute phase. Your brain is starting to resettle. And then you drop again, but it's gotten used to 75 milligrams and you drop 25. So it's a 33% dose reduction. And the same thing happens over the next week. And then it's a 50% dose reduction. And you eventually have to go from something to nothing, right? So the progression through the taper is also harder and harder as you're, of course, getting weaker and more tired. And so anybody who spends a lot of time dealing with people who suffer from addiction or have to go through a lot of tapers because of their chronic medication will tell you it's very common to fail a taper at the very end. You put in all this hard work, you get so close, and then you aren't able to finish it out. And that's why. So that's also part of what happened to me. It got harder and harder. And I tried every day for 4 weeks to find someone to help me. Nobody at any of these hospitals would help. Nobody, you know, my initial prescribing physician, he admitted very quickly in the first week when I got really sick, he immediately said, look, I don't know what I'm doing. Go back on the meds, find someone better. But we couldn't find anyone better because that pain team, they wouldn't touch us. They said, we're an inpatient team. We found another pain team, an independent clinic, and they said, well, we can give you more drugs, but we don't help people taper. That's the job of addiction medicine. And I said, do I need addiction medicine? It says, yeah, it sounds like you do. And so I called addiction medicine. They listened to my story and they said, no, you're not addicted. You're just dependent. You have an inability to get off the drug because of the withdrawal side effects. You're not our problem, right? We're dealing with transitioning people into methadone and buprenorphine and keeping them there for some length of time. You just need a doctor who is competent in the first place to prescribe you this medication, to de-prescribe you this medication. And so that game of hot potato continued for 4 weeks, and we just stuck to the plan because I truly believed that if I ever went back on the medication, I'd just never come off it. I would never be willing to go through this again if I rescued myself from it. But like so many people, at the end, I gave up. So in week 4, I hadn't slept in 4 days. I was having really, really dark thoughts almost all day, every day. I started thinking about whether my family would be better off if I died. Started to think about whether I should help them with that. And that's when we got scared enough. And I said, well, I guess it's time to go back on the medication. And the only reason that I'm here giving this talk instead of kind of whatever lies down that path, right, is because I formulated a plan. I will go back on the medication. Sadia went and picked up a new bottle of Oxycontin. That was the plan. I went to bed that night for the first time in a very long time. And I was going to take 1 pill an hour until the symptoms were relieved enough that I could sleep. And whatever that dose was, that was going to be my new starting dose. And the only reason I'm here, instead of what lies down that path, is because I never took the first pill. I fell asleep. I laid down for the first time in a long time. And I said, I'm not going to give up for a few more hours. I just got to try one more time. And I fell asleep. I slept for about 6 hours that night. And when I woke up, I will not say that I felt great, but the symptoms had abated enough that I thought, okay, I can do this. I can finish detoxing. Okay. So here's the question that would initially come to occupy me. That's a long story about failures in medicine. But it's not the traditional story about failures regarding opioids, especially in North America right now. Because remember, I wanted to talk about June 16th. I want to talk about that day in particular. So let's go back. This isn't fitting that nice narrative that you may have read in the media for the last several years, where doctors just prescribed opioids hands over fist and got America addicted to these pills, and now we're all dying. That's not what happened that day. Because first, they wouldn't give me the medication I needed, right? First, they treated me with suspicion, and then they eventually gave me pills hand over fist, right? But it also wasn't that they probably gave me too much. It's maybe that they gave me exactly how much I needed on that day. Something more complicated was going on, which is that they gave me a bunch and then abdicated all responsibility, right? So the reason I think June 16th is so important is because it shows that we are really, really bad at pain medicine, right? We're not just screwing up in some predictable way where we just give everybody pills. We're screwing up in multiple directions at the same time. We're withholding medication and we're giving too much medication, and maybe sometimes we're giving the right amount, but then we're not tracking it, we're not managing it, right? So I was consumed by this question, how did we get here where we are so desperately bad at this? I'm going to give you a really quick version of the answer I found. It's fascinating enough that I wrote a whole chapter on it. If you like history, I recommend that you go look into this because it's wild. But I'm going to give you the like 6-minute version of a 5,000-year history of opioid development because it's wild. All right. So how did we get here? I think I found the answer, like the answer that shows why we are so screwed up. And it starts, like I said, more than 5,000 years ago. We know that at least that far back, the ancient Sumerians figured out how to extract opium from the poppy plant. So that's what you see here. You score an underripe opium plant, you get this milky substance, scrape it off, dry it in the sun, it turns into powder, you can eat it, you can rub it on your gums, we eventually figured out you can smoke it for better effect. The reason it wasn't destroying societies for 5,000 years, which is not to say it didn't have any effect, right? We fought wars over this stuff. But the reason it wasn't constantly destroying societies the way opioids are in North America today is because opium is not that great a drug. It's really good when it's all you have. It's by far the best analgesic that you can find in nature, right? But it's nothing compared to what we have today. So for a very long time, we used opium. Well or badly, it didn't have a huge effect in terms of, creating big epidemics like we see today. That changed eventually in the 19th century, because in the span of just a few decades, so blink of an eye, historically speaking, two things happened. One, scientists figured out how to isolate the active alkaloids in opium. And so the really good one, we ended up using all three, but the really good one, so we end up still using thebaine a little bit today, right? But morphine, that's the stuff we want. So the active alkaloid in opium that we started using a lot was morphine. So we isolate that, but then really shortly after, we developed this, the hypodermic syringe. So we go from, a lot of people using opium by ingesting it. You eat it, you rub it on your gums. You're gonna have first pass metabolism. It's gonna have to go through your liver, slow onset. There's a lot of time for your body to adjust. Figured out that you can smoke it, it's a little bit better. Now we figure out you can inject it straight into your veins, right to your central nervous system, right? So we're able to take really big doses, whopping doses of this stuff, inject it directly into your veins. And this is such a potent combination that I do not know if this is apocryphal or not. It was reported by Sam Quinones in Dreamland, but the story goes that the very first recorded opioid overdose from injected morphine was the wife of the guy who invented the hypodermic syringe. So that's how potent this was. When you don't know how to dose it yet, straight to the central nervous system, overdosing is so easy. So this all happens in the 19th century. In North America, what's going on? We're fighting a civil war, all this meatball surgery going on, battlefield amputations, lots of chronic pain among soldiers. We give out morphine to everybody. It's easy to mass produce. We have a lot of access to it. It's so common for soldiers, Civil War soldiers, to develop what at the time we called habit, that we called habit, what we would call today either dependence or addiction if we were paying careful attention to what their symptoms are. We called it soldier's disease, right? This is happening over the 19th century. It kicks off the pharmaceutical arms race, the search for the Holy Grail, which, by the way, we are still engaged in today, right? The search for the pharmaceutical Holy Grail is a safe but still effective opioid painkiller, something as powerful as morphine, that first thing that the gods delivered to us that could just knock you out and relieve any pain, no matter how severe, something that good that isn't going to get you addicted and or kill you, right? So, fast forward 130 some, 140 years later, we're still engaged in that search, by the way, but this is what kicks it off because we need to do better than morphine. And the very first player on the field to say we've improved on this, we have a safe, effective version of what morphine was supposed to be, an opioid painkiller, was heroin. So this was devised by a little German company nobody had heard of. It was called Heroin because it was named after the German heroisch, for the heroic feeling that the scientists got when they sampled their own product. And that little company you may have heard of because at the time it was called Friedrich Bayer and Company, now known as Bayer Pharmaceutical. So in 1898, Bayer unleashes heroin onto the world. So fun fact, heroin helped get aspirin across the finish line. So now when you're taking your aspirin, you can think, thanks to heroin for funding the final development of this. But heroin is sold to the world as a safe and effective painkiller. And so we already had this burgeoning morphine epidemic, and we tried to solve it with heroin. We have mass production available at the turn of the century. Bayer, Heinrich Draeser, the guy who heads the pharmaceutical division, basically told pharmacists and doctors, he wrote for medical journals, that this is a non-addictive opioid. And so you should actually use it in place of morphine. In fact, you can use it to treat morphine addiction, which funny enough is in fact still true, but that's for later. But not in the way he meant it. He meant, look, heroin's non-addictive, morphine is, so you replace it and you get rid of the addiction. And I don't know why he thought that. I don't know why he thought any of these things, but the result of trying to stem the morphine addiction epidemic with heroin is exactly what you think it is, right? It's an epidemic of addiction and overdose and death. And it was so bad that within 10 years, then President Teddy Roosevelt comes in and says, we have to fix this. Tens of thousands of people are dying across the country. So he appoints the country's first ever drug czar. So when you hear language about the ONDCP, right, the so-called drug czar in the White House staff, this goes back to 1908. The first guy was Hamilton Wright. He's got a pretty uncomplicated view of drugs. And so he says, when he takes the job, Americans are the biggest drug fiends in the world. That's a quote. So his uncomplicated of drugs is we got to solve this by clamping down on it. And that's what he does. Starting in 1908, we start clamping down on narcotics, which is the term to then lump a bunch of the bad drugs together. 1914, we get the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act, heavily taxes and regulates these narcotics. And by 1924, you get the Heroin Act, which outlaws all production, manufacture, and distribution of heroin. And so we enter this period of prohibition, right? And not coincidentally, I'm sure that this is like the prohibitionist era, right? This is the 19-teens and 20s. But prohibition, when it comes to opioids, lodges firmly in the mindset of North Americans. And it sticks for the better part of half a century. We are scared of morphine and heroin. And so that pharmaceutical arms race kicks into high gear. And over the course of the 20th century, we develop more and more opioid painkillers because we're always looking for the one that's safe and effective, that works like morphine but doesn't kill people, right? So somehow we get from this period of prohibition that lasts all through the 40s, the 50s, into the 60s, somehow we get from there to this. So the numerical pain rating scale, if you've ever been to a doctor in your life for pain, you've heard them say, can you rate your pain on a scale of 0 to 10, with 0 being no pain at all and 10 being the worst pain you can imagine? I heard that question about 4 billion times in 2015. It's a very strange tool. We can talk about that too if you want. But the reason that tool exists is because we did start taking pain really seriously by the end of the 20th century. So how do we get from prohibition to here? That's a more complicated story than I can do in 6 minutes. So here's the short version. You had the rise of a palliative care field. You have people who start seeing like, look, we're living longer. We're living long enough to die of really terrible diseases like cancer. We're letting our cancer patients go unmedicated. So you have Kathleen Foley, one of the founders of the palliative care field, going on record saying, we're letting people die from actively dying from cancer. Some of the worst pain you can possibly imagine, and we're withholding morphine because we don't want them to become an addict. That is perverse. So you have this really well-meaning palliative care field pushing a pain advocacy moment. And it wraps up in a civil rights moment where people are using language like rights of underrepresented groups. So you should get patient rights into this advocacy moment. And it starts to build steam. And so you get a real patient advocacy group, really real patient advocacy moment. And eventually it starts to intersect with pharma money. And not all of it does, obviously, right? But you start to get funding from big, powerful groups because they have a vested interest in selling medication. And so in the 1990s, you get big pharma coming in with new medications specifically designed to treat our problem, America's problem of wanting to treat pain, but not wanting to use opioids, right? And you get them funding pain groups, pain organizations that are doing advocacy work, like the American Pain Society. So in 1998, you actually get the American Pain Society president going on record and coining the term pain is the fifth vital sign. Pain ought to be treated like blood pressure and respiration. It's something you check every time you interact with a patient. That's why we need this tool, this scale, 0 to 10, the pain scale, because if you're checking with your patient about their pain every time you see them, you need a quick way to say, what's your pain like? But if they tell you a 4, that's really far away from a 0. Now you really feel like you ought to do something about it. And so this creates a lot of distress by clinicians. And the moment is so ripe for someone to come in and say, don't be distressed, physicians, because here's something you can give them with a clear conscience. So almost exactly 100 years after Bayer gives us heroin as the non-addictive holy grail of pharmacy, right? We had another little company that like no one's heard of at the time, Purdue Pharma, it's Purdue Frederick out here in Maryland, right? They give us this drug, Oxycontin, and they try the same message. It's a less addictive, but more effective opioid. And again, they had no reason for believing this. It's crazy. You know, 1898, Bayer did this with heroin. 1996, Purdue did this with Oxycontin. And it was wrong when they both did it. It was illegal when Purdue did it. And that's why they don't exist as a private company anymore, why they're being put into public trust and have been sued for 10 to $12 billion, right? So Oxycontin is sold to the world as the safe and effective pain reliever. And it is not the only drug that is given this promise, and Purdue is not the only bad player. It ends up being a lot of pharmaceutical companies. Insys Therapeutics actually ends up going in for felony charges, you know, directly related to things like kickbacks, really egregious. You get distributors, you get pharmacies. There's this huge corrupt moment where a lot of powerful people with a profit motive get together and try to tell us that we can treat pain with a clear conscience, which clinicians desperately want to do because we have safe and effective tools now. And just like it was 100 years before, the result is exactly what you think it is. It's an epidemic of addiction and overdose and death. Okay, so why did I tell you these 2 long stories? I'm actually going to wrap here in a minute because we're almost out of time. I want to have some discussion. But the reason I told you these 2 long stories is because this graph is the very common, most people see now, CDC graph of overdose death rates involving opioids starting about 1999. And the most recent one goes up to only 2016 or 2017. And the purple line, second from the top, shows the overdose death rate from prescription opioids. And that death rate quadruples between 1999 and 2011. And at that exact same time, during that exact same period, the volume of prescription opioids being put out into the country quadruples, right? It's a perfect trend line match. But we do eventually peak. And the reason we peak is because the country starts to freak out, just like Teddy Roosevelt did when he hired Hamilton Wright. We start to say, CDC, clamp down on this. FDA, clamp down on this. Doctors, stop killing your patients. I know we told you not to torture them and to give them drugs, but we changed our mind. Stop killing your patients by giving them pills, right? And so they did. Pretty reliably, they started to slow their prescribing. And right about this time is when that happened. If you put this up with a volume prescribed graph, it matches almost perfectly. So the overdose death rate from prescriptions did start to curve down. But notice that the overdose death rate did not slow down when you take in all opioids, because that death rate not only continues to increase, it speeds up the rate of increase afterwards. And the reason is we squeeze the supply of prescription opioids, and so heroin takes off. That's the blue line. And when there's a ton of heroin in the streets, it gets contaminated with fentanyl, which is the orange line. And fentanyl is 50 to 100 times more potent than morphine. Okay, so 2015, that's when I'm in the hospital. Why did I tell you these long stories? Because I think I understand how we got here. I think I understand why we're so bad at pain medicine. Because we're mid-pendulum swing. Because for 150 years, we have dramatically swung the pendulum back and forth between being terrified of opioids and thinking that they're God's gift to humans. So think about this really simple, so here's our lesson, right? We're really bad at pain medicine. So think about this really simple spectrum, this attitude towards opioids. You can fall on one end. You can be a prohibitionist. We have definitely tried that. We spent much of the 20th century in this mode. Opioids are bad. You should not use them if you're a clinician. You could also be, hey, drugs for everyone. We tried this too, starting in about 1996, right? We started to try to get clinicians more and more comfortable with just giving patients pills for all of their pain. Oxycontin was actually branded as the pill for nearly every pain, right? And both of those are terrible models. If you're a prohibitionist, well, we've already seen that that could lead to really terrible public health crises. It's done that at least twice in the last 150 years. And if you give drugs to everyone, it turns out, sorry, if you're prohibitionist, you can leave people in desperate pain. That's the cancer patient lesson, right? And if you give drugs to everyone, at least twice in the last 150 years, that's caused a public health crisis. So there's this really simple lesson. And I'm sorry that it's so simple because I told these two long stories for this really simple lesson. The simple lesson is we have to be somewhere in the middle, right? We can't be prohibitionists and we can't give drugs to everyone. There are extra slides here that I'm only going to show you in case you want to ask about them, but we're going to wrap with a kind of preview of where we're going to go from here. But the extra slides is, especially if you're a clinician, you might want to know, okay, your graph there is kind of cute, but it gives us zero information. Thanks a lot. And so you might be like, what does it look like to live somewhere in the middle of that graph? And I think if we look at a bunch of data that shows how much more likely you are to stay on opioids if you use them longer, we can actually learn some really interesting things. And so the slope of this graph is showing the percentage probability of staying on opioids for a year, and then 3 years below is the dotted line, depending on how many days your initial prescription was. So look, if you get a single day's prescription, there's a 6% chance you'll be on opioids a year later. That's already a pretty bad adverse outcome for a lot of cases. But if you go past a 10-day prescription, a quarter of those patients are on opioids a year later. And if you go past a month initial prescription, almost 45% of those patients are on opioids a year later. So I think this leads to the Travis Reeder's patented principle for responsible prescribing. I think we need to recognize that it's not all about appropriate initiation. Appropriate initiation is important. Don't give opioids out for routine teeth extractions, which everyone who didn't grow up in the US is like, you all really did that? Yeah, we totally give out bottles of Vicodin and Percocet for getting a routine tooth pull, right? But it's not all about that. That's like the thing that people are able to get their heads around, and they're like, don't do that. And you can yell at dentists and it's very easy. But what that graph shows is, look, sometimes you need opioids, like when you get your foot blown apart, and then you need someone to watch the patient, right? You need to actually be in contact with them. You need to manage these medications that change their properties over time. You need to manage them for the long term. And obviously I'm pretty partial to this. For the love of God, if you give opioids to somebody, you need to know how to get them off of the opioids. So the catchphrase is responsible prescribing entails knowing how to deprescribe. And that's just something that we've never taught clinicians, ever, in North America. So the thing that looks off to next week is, if you go back to the graph I talked about, we peaked prescribing in around 2010 to 2012, and that started to bend the curve of opioid overdose from prescriptions down in America. This really unsurprising thing to a lot of us who spent more than 9 seconds thinking about it is that it didn't solve the opioid crisis. It didn't solve the drug overdose crisis, because it turns out when people have an addiction, they might be willing to get their drugs from elsewhere. And so when the streets are flushed with heroin, you don't have to get your drugs from a doctor. And so the drug overdose crisis in North America right now is really different from the prescription one. And so on Friday, Hannah's going to talk about addiction in particular, which I highly recommend you come back for because it's an awesome talk. I've heard it before. But then Wednesday, we can kind of blend those so we can talk more about my thing, which is America's crisis, and her thing, which is the nature of addiction, and think a lot about, you know, how do we solve this crisis that so-called fixing prescriptions, telling doctors not to give them out anymore, did not help. It made worse.